Good morning, Eleanor Saunders, and you're most welcome to Cornucopia Climate Chats. I met Eleanor during my course in Trinity, and she specialises in climate change and climate adaptation, and she was one of the tutors in my course. So, welcome, Eleanor, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, thank you, Deirdre. It's lovely to be here and wonderful to be on Cornucopia Climate Chats. So, as you say, I'm Eleanor Saunders. I'm a consultant in the climate space, and I mostly look at education and innovation. So, of course, you met me through your course in Trinity. So, there I was there in my education capacity. So, I set up courses around climate change, help people in terms of learning around climate change. And then in my other piece of work around innovation, I'm helping people with the process of climate change. How do they create change to help us be more adapted to climate change? How do we bring in new things and ideas? And how do we make sure that we're always moving forward?
Great. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about a conference that you attended called Adaptation Futures in New
Mhm.
Zealand recently. But prior to that, before we move into New Zealand, which is in the Southern Hemisphere and a little different from things here in Ireland, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? When you were a child, what inspired you to get into the environmental space? What was your trajectory?
I grew up in Wicklow town and I actually grew up in a hotel there. And my mother would have been the chef in the hotel. And she really specialized in making sure that food had flowers in it, so floral cookery. And so as a child, I grew up around a lot of food. A lot of good food and a lot of very sort of organic food, but mostly fruits, vegetables, and flowers, bringing the flowers into it. So I saw this kind of real creativity and sort of love around nature and how we interact with that and how it's important to us, and also how it comes into businesses as well, how we sort of use nature in that way. So I had, yeah, a really great love for things around me. And we go for nature walks and we go foraging. And yeah, I just got a real deep appreciation for everything that was out there that we're part of.
And what decade did you grow up in, may I ask? It's just interesting for our listeners. Are you an 80s child, a 70s child?
Oh, so I'm an 80s child, yes. So yeah,
You're an
80s,
80s
80s and
child. Yeah, you're
90s,
an
I
80s.
guess, were my
Oh,
my
yes. So
childhood
that was
teenage
very
years.
yeah, the era that Cornucopia was founded in, and there was a lot of interest, I remember, when we came back from the States in nature and the environment. It was quite an active movement. So it's nothing new to us in Ireland. It's really interesting to know. And then you were telling me you went on to study medicine, pathology. Climate wasn't your first port of call.
Climate wasn't my first point of call. No, after I finished school, I went off to Edinburgh, across the sea, and did pathology there. Edinburgh's got a rich history around pathology, actually. A lot of things we know from anatomy and stuff comes from there, and also a bit of a gory history around body snatching and things. I don't know how much our listeners are into that, but there's a darker side to Edinburgh if anyone's ever visiting there. So yeah, I went there and studied pathology, and I did think that I would probably go more into the medicine side, things like cancer research. And actually, I did a little bit of work in a cancer research lab. But I found that for me, I really wanted to be doing something that had more immediate sharing, more kind of people contact. And so I moved from that to looking at, well, education. First of all, I became a secondary school teacher. I was a science teacher in a secondary school in London. And then looking more broadly at science communication. How do we help people to communicate around science, to engage with science? And from there, the climate space really started to open up for me. I think climate was just becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And as I started to work more with universities then at that stage around education pieces, a lot of them were looking at climate education and how did we do that and how did we bring that into curriculums and into people's awareness.
And that's so important, the connection between science and people. And
Mm.
often there's a suspicion around science, particularly with probably climate denial and thinking that it's not so bad or it's happened before or it's exaggerated and that, and it may be a mistrust of science. So that's a really important piece, how science and data can be trusted and then how it can be communicated to people so that it moves into people's consciousness and awareness, and of course into legislative change also. So specific to Ireland, before we move south to the Pacific, to the South Pacific, and your recent adventure there, can you tell me how you think Ireland is adapting to ever-present climate change? I know we had a particularly severe storm early in 2025 in January, Storm Owen. Can you tell us about that and how we might be getting more prepared for future such weather events?
We certainly did have a bad storm, and I'm sure a lot of people will remembering it. And depending on where you lived in Ireland, it hit you at different levels. So for those on the west and those in the Midlands, Storm Owen really hit people hard, and there was a lot of flooding, there was a lot of electricity out, there was a lot of water shortages, and actually it really showed up Ireland's lack of preparedness for events like that. We're not used to getting storms of that magnitude. And climate predictions say that we will get more storms of that magnitude more frequently and stronger storms as well. So we do need, an electricity system where the poles don't all blow over and we're all left without electric, or a water system that doesn't flood and overwhelm, and then we don't have clean water that can be sent around, or also that isn't reliant on electricity to pipe it around. And thinking of people just staying warm as well, making sure that you've got the electric to run that, making sure that you've got access to heating. So yeah, Storm Owen really did show us up a little bit. And I know for myself, like working in Trinity at the time, my teaching assistant, she was living in Offaly. She had no running water for nearly 2 weeks after the storm, and it's really hard to deal with. I mean, how do you wash? How do you drink? How do you get access to water when you don't have it in your home? So we need to have a better level of preparedness. And how are we going about it? Well, slowly, I would say. We're kind of getting aware of some of the things that need to be done, and there would be some policies and practices in place. A lot of them would actually be more about climate mitigation. So there's these sort of two differences, right? There's climate mitigation and there's climate adaptation. And climate mitigation is about trying to stop climate change from happening in the first place. So trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the air. So this is not burning so many fossil fuels and things like getting your solar energy. That's shifting us to renewable energy. That's climate mitigation. Whereas climate adaptation is saying, look, climate change is here. We don't want it to get worse, but it is here to a certain extent. How do we make sure we're future proofed against that? And a lot of the things that we do in Ireland are still kind of on the climate mitigation side, which is brilliant. And we also need to do more of those. There was an article just this morning in the RTE saying that we have not met, in fact, overshot our targets for 2025 in terms of how much carbon we're allowed to emit. So we still need to be mitigating. But yeah, getting around to that idea of adapting as well. So things like how do we stop that creep of water coming in on the coastal regions or allow more soak away of water when there's heavy rain? How do we make sure if there is, for Ireland, hot periods? I know we don't necessarily see them hot compared to the rest of the world, but heat for us, are we ready for that? And we're not in a lot of cases. So yeah, extra wet and extra heat are kind of two things we will be facing and we're not totally
How
ready
does,
for.
how
Yeah.
does that translate into action? Is it communities that need to act, or is it government that needs to act? How do you feel about that?
It's at all levels, and there's also got to be an interaction between the two, right? I mean, government's role is to support us and help us, and we need to have policy in place that allows us to make change. But equally, communities do need to be stepping up and making change themselves because government, and no diss to the Irish government, governments in general, they don't always move fast enough. Whereas as a community, you can be a little bit quicker, a little bit more agile. So, at a community level, we can be doing things like making sure we're respecting our green spaces, keeping them there. The amount of protection that we get from nature is huge. Just the ability for trees to soak up excess water, for good soil to be able to give us food in the future, and also for that kind of cooling effect from water and from trees and from plants. So, the more that you can kind of bring nature into your community, and the more that you can also do things within the community, like moving towards solar energy. It's not climate adaptation, as I said, but it's still important part of the picture. And, taking up the government support that's there, switching to electric as much as you can. And then it's the government's role to make sure that that electricity is clean, because there's no point in switching yourself to electric if actually at the core of it, it's still coming from fossil fuels. There's got to be this balance between the two. Government have a big piece to play, but communities can certainly be taking action as well.
And in your consultation work, are you asked to go on various committees with the government, or how does that work? Are there local authorities that you speak to, or where does the impetus for change come from? Where does the push and
Yeah.
the drive come from?
Again, it kind of comes from all over. Government is always very dictated by the political mood at the time. Obviously, at the moment, we're seeing large influence from our friends in the United States of America who are very anti anything climate at the moment. And so, you get these sort of shifts and trends in politics, which sometimes things like councils are a little bit immune from. I would go and work with councils more than necessarily I'd go and work with government, but that's just me. That's not to say that the government aren't bringing in other people to advise. But yeah, it would tend to be more on that kind of council level. How can they get more community groups engaged in climate action? How can they be doing climate action themselves? Yeah, there's kind of a nice drive that's happening there at the moment.
That would be important, I would think. I'm imagining now Wicklow County Council and you being at a meeting there and planning how can we stop the sea coming in at Bray, or what steps should
Yeah,
be taken, and that local communities need to be organising themselves and not just sitting passively by and waiting for government to act, because that's not the
exactly.
way things happen. Government are sort of our instrument in a way, and not
Yeah.
necessarily our parent.
Yeah, you said at the start, what am I child of? Child of the 80s, and even going back to sort of the 70s before that, that idea of activism as well. We can't
Yeah,
rely on government to do everything. It's got to be there. We don't want to overthrow it. It does good, but there needs to be a kind of
need
that level
stop.
of action coming up as well. Yeah.
I think there is a rising level of activism, which is pretty wonderful, and raising of consciousness, which is intersectional. We had a chat earlier, so we were talking about the intersectionality of so many things.
Hmm.
So moving from Ireland now to this wonderful conference that you attended, which is sort of parallel to the COP conferences. It's called Adaptation Futures. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that organization?
This is a big conference dedicated to climate adaptation. So, like I say, that idea of making changes for the climate change that's already here. And yeah, it started originally as a scientific conference, as many conferences do. So scientists getting together and trying to share knowledge and talk about what's going on in the climate adaptation field. But it's moved over the years to really try and bring in more communities, policy, government, different financiers and funders to really become something that's more holistic, more all encompassing, because there is this realization that scientists alone, and we just talked about governments alone, are not going to be able to fully adapt to climate change. This has to be everybody. Everybody has to be part of this. And so if you're having these international conferences, they need to be everyone. So I think of it actually as shifting more towards being a forum to talk about climate adaptation. And this year it was hosted in New Zealand. And I have to say, they did a fabulous job of really taking on board that idea that it needed to shift and be everybody. So we really saw kind of a cross section of global society coming together in New Zealand. And they also made sure that in the program, there were things like the voice of artists. What's the role of artists to make us aware of climate change? What's the role of song, of dance, of speech within that? And these are things that we don't often think about when we think about a conference on climate adaptation. You don't think about those parts of it. But if we really want to enact change, these are super important parts.
Yes, for winning people's hearts as well as minds. Art is so important because it
Mhm.
speaks so much to something beyond the intellect, which really moves people. Yeah, so that sounds great. So where in New Zealand did it take place?
Yeah, so it's in Christchurch, which is on the South Island of New Zealand. It's on the east coast of the South Island. And Christchurch, we're known for many things, but it did have a very large earthquake now a good few years back. But it really hit global news for that. And it was quite decimated by this earthquake. And still the city is kind of recovering from it, but it is at a stage now where the city is kind of mostly back in place. So they have some lovely facilities. They have a brand new conference centre because of the earthquake. I mean, you'd almost wish they didn't have a brand new conference centre because you'd have hoped they hadn't had an earthquake. But nonetheless, they had fabulous, yeah, facilities. And I think it was really great for Christchurch as well. There were a lot of people locally there from Christchurch who were just saying what a boost it was to really put it on the international stage in this way, and how, New Zealand's very aware of effects of climate change. And even when we talk about things like Earthquakes, there is evidence that earthquakes may become more prevalent or of higher magnitude as ice melts and weight distribution on tectonic plates shifts. We might start to get more tectonic action. So even things like that we don't necessarily attribute to climate change, they might be in the future. So yeah, they really are at the forefront of understanding natural disasters and what that looks like. So it's important to them to be bringing together people to talk about how we get more resilient to that.
That conference center sounds wonderful. I did do a little research on it, and I think there was about 3,000 people attending. So it must have been a very lively
It
event.
was.
Spoke about the fact that the islands in the Pacific Ocean are under
Mm.
particular threat. And can you speak about that and the island nations and which islands we're speaking about and what was talked about there?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, the Pacific's a really interesting region. And, growing up in Ireland, like when you go to geography in school and you're shown the map, you don't even see the Pacific, right? The map, the flat map that we look at just cuts out the entirety of the Pacific. It's a huge space, it's a huge ocean, and there's a lot of islands in it. And these islands are nations. And they have a lot of fabulous and wonderful people living on them with really deeply ingrained cultures. They're quite unique because they've been created in this island system, so very far away from everything else. You get a huge variety of languages across the Pacific Islands. The country of Papua New Guinea, which is in the Pacific but not an island as such, there's over 900 languages in Papua New Guinea that are recognized, that are spoken, that are used. And I mean, we know better than anyone here in Ireland how much language and culture are tied together as well. So you really see this richness of different cultures, different types of people across the Pacific. But these islands are small, a lot of them are very low lying. So when we talk about sea level rise, they're one of the first locations that will be really hit, that could actually wipe out nations. Not just, in Ireland, we think about sea level rise and we're like, okay, well, maybe we move away from the coastal regions a bit. In some of these islands in the Pacific, it's a matter of the whole island is gone, it's underwater. They're also being hit hugely more by cyclones, tropical storms, and things like tsunamis as well. So they're highly vulnerable to these. And cyclones, so sort of really serious weather events, really high winds, really high rains, these are increasing threefold than what we used to see as we see climate change coming in. So these communities really are at the forefront of having to either leave, but no one wants to leave their country, right? You don't want to leave your home and your culture and your place of being, or adapt to how things are changing. So yeah, they need to be more resilient to these bigger, worse storms. They need to have plans in place.
Can you name some of these islands?
People will have heard of like Fiji and Hawaii, so they're Pacific Islands, but there's also a whole range more. There's the Solomon Islands, there's Vanuatu, there's Kiribati, and actually I'm naming a few that were there and that were present and were speaking with me as well. Yeah, you do see a whole range of different islands across the Pacific. There's a lot of them there.
Wonderful. And so, when you were at the conference, did you meet people from the islands, some of the indigenous people from New Zealand and Australia? Were they present?
Yeah, and there was a real push to try and bring Indigenous people to the conference as well. So again, this split from just scientists talking about it to actually people who are on the ground and facing things. So I had a wonderful group of people who came from the Solomon Islands and Kiribati who I was speaking to. There were a group of them who have become knowledge brokers around climate change. So they're trying to make themselves champions within their own communities of understanding and knowing what's going on in terms of climate change so they can then spread that to others. And it's difficult. Some of these communities are very remote, so it's often hard for them to get information, and there won't necessarily be data on their specific island. So to have somebody whose kind of role it is to go and find that out is wonderful. But then to be able to communicate that, and this comes back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, to everyone else within their island. So we had this fabulous artist, and he was getting groups of communities together to talk about what does it look like for us to understand climate adaptation? And he drew these fabulous pictures where you have people looking at sort of the raging sea, huge waves, the dolphins. So the dolphins are always sort of a sign of support to them, but the dolphins swimming away from them, that things are going badly. And then in the distance, the kind of clouds breaking and there being their island, but idealized, calm sea, the dolphins are back around it, the trees aren't swaying anymore. And it's this idea of, knowing that this storm is coming and how to get through it, how to get back to that other side of the islands that they've always lived on and loved. So, yeah, really kind of fabulous and inspiring seeing his work, talking to them about what it means to them, and this sort of challenge, which we face everywhere, of the general masses of people not necessarily really understanding, or it's really difficult to think about what could be when you've never experienced it. And if you're being told what could be is dangerous and is bad, it's even harder to get your mindset around. So having ways for people to really begin kind of getting their ideas around that, in this case, seeing artworks. They'd also developed a song, because by singing about these things, they were able to kind of communicate better about it. People would get on board, engaging with the song and then thinking about the lyrics of that. And you see, you're really kind of seeing these ways of how do you get down to people in need who are vulnerable.
That's so important, then bringing art and music into the space rather than science and fear, because
Mm,
fear is such a turn off. Eyes glaze over, we don't want to know. Let's
yeah.
carry on and assume something to take our mind off it. So this is something that you must meet every day. And you were
Yeah.
saying also that youth were very present, young people were very present. And you spoke to me particularly about this organization of young people who are connected between New Zealand across the wide, wide Pacific Ocean, all the way to South America. So,
Mm.
can you tell us about that group? I had a little look at them prior to our talking here today, and it's now expanded all over the world, but it's just young people connecting across the Pacific.
This is a fabulous initiative. It's called The Ocean That Connects Us. So, the Pacific being the ocean that connects all these different groups. Like you say, it has kind of grown broader than that, but they were really looking at anyone who's in the Pacific or touching onto the Pacific at first. And it's secondary school age children. And what they do is they connect up in groups and they run citizen science projects. I went to meet them, but both they were at the conference, so I met them there. But I also went to meet one of the schools up in Auckland. I went to Rosmini School and met some of the students there. And there I had a bit more time with them, so they were really able to tell me about the projects they're doing. So there's one group where there's a couple of children in the school and they're working with those who are in Chile and they're looking at microplastics. So they're taking samples from the environment, they're looking at microplastics within that, and then within their school settings, they're trying to raise awareness of what they find and also help people to reduce their plastic consumption within the schools. So kind of coming up with projects and ways for them to do that, getting rid of single-use plastics and yeah, trying to just really eliminate plastics from the schools, but very much led from the students and from this international voice of students. And we had another group who were looking at water quality and they were looking at the different lakes in their own countries and regions and looking at how the lakes were changing over time. And again, just sharing this and, that ability to at that age and as part of your kind of school training, when you're still so plastic and understanding how the world works, to be able to hear from people on the other side of the world in a different culture with a different way of doing things, but seeing that actually we are all facing pollution to our lakes, we are all facing microplastics, we are all facing climate change, that there's this uniting factor of something that needs action around it. And yeah, these young people were so inspiring, and the discussions they had around hope. What does hope mean for them? What does it look like in the future? How do they ensure that people really care deeply about things? How do they bring back that care and love and ownership for things that have taken time and that we've engaged with slowly, as opposed to all of these sort of fast things, fast food, fast fashion, fast consumerism. How do we step away from that? So yeah, they were brilliant. They were full of ideas. They were so interconnected. I hope they're our leaders of the future.
Well, that sounds absolutely wonderful. And, I had a look at the globe on Google Earth and I was putting my finger across all the way from New Zealand all the way over to Chile. And it's amazing. It's just the vastness of water between, and yet it's the same ocean, and how the ability of Zoom or whatever to connect these young people together, and that they have microplastics in the water on both shores, and
Yeah.
to see that and to connect those young people together. That sounds absolutely thrilling and full of hope for the future, and young people being engaged and hopeful and having some kind of awareness of consciousness One of the other things we spoke about when we were chatting earlier was about if the worst comes to the worst and people have to vacate those islands, which is utterly tragic, but also reality that Australia is starting to grant visas to climate migrants. So, can you
Yes.
speak a little about that?
Yeah, very tragic event, but as you say, also a reality. So Australia has started to do this already. They've opened up their first set of climate visas. So acknowledging that the people on these islands are losing their countries and that it's not their own fault. It is the fault of other countries. It is because of how much we have consumed fossil fuels, raised global temperatures, raised the waters. So yeah, there is this kind of call out, and Australia have stepped up to that a little bit. But it's a very interesting concept because it's brand new, and how these people really transfer across from their nation to Australia or in the future to other countries. What does that look like? How are they integrated? How do they hold and retain their culture? And, we have experience of people who migrate and what that holding of culture looks like, but we don't really have global experience of the complete loss of a country, of your homeland not existing at all anymore. And not in a political sense, but just in no sense. It's just physically not there anymore. And so, yeah, how do we deal with people like that? And I mean, we have huge questions as humanity that are going to be coming up for us in the future. And with these island nations, you really see that possibility of the loss of a nation and movement for it. But I'm sure we will also see in other places where you have countries that the country won't go away physically, but you're going to have such high levels of drought or such extreme heat or such extreme intrusion of salt water that they can't grow food, that you will also get movement of others in the future. So migration is here to stay, and climate migration is going to be a real reality going into the future.
Yes, and that has implications for Ireland also, in that we are living in somewhat of a Goldilocks zone at the moment,
Mm.
neither too hot nor too cold. And obviously, we'll have our rains and our storms. But the fact is, there's no predictions, I don't think, that we're going to go over 40 degrees in heat or under minus 40 in cold, which other parts of the planet, which will become uninhabitable, will become. So the migration north is a huge issue, which we won't go into too deeply today. But just we should be aware of the need to manage all this. Otherwise, the
Yeah.
downside of it could be just too fierce. Now, another thing, and I didn't discuss this with you earlier, but are there parts of the planet which are now uninhabitable, like the northern snow covered areas of the planet, that in the future may be new territories? If the snow disappears and the ice, should I say, not the snow, the ice disappears. Have you any thoughts, or
Yeah.
has that ever come up in any of the
So
discussions?
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you are correct. As places become uninhabitable, other places may become habitable. And we do see things like receding snowfields, which are opening up spaces that people can go to now. You do see creep of where people can live, where they can farm, where they can go. Kind of a sad side to this can also be sometimes when you get places that we can now reach that we couldn't before. One of the first things that happens is oil exploration. And we all know that if you dig up and burn more oil, you're only going to get more climate change. And I suppose something to sort of remember about these locations as well is that they may become more habitable in terms of not being so ice covered anymore, or they might get, more rain, so they're a bit more fertile. But everywhere is going to experience more unpredictable weather. So they won't be free from storms, from high winds, and from things like that that we're still not necessarily able to kind of cope with. So there isn't this sort of utopia opening up on the poles that we'll just be able to move to and it'll be the new Ireland. But yeah, you are absolutely right that there is this creep away of unusable land, which is opening up some usable land for sure.
Have you any books that you'd like to recommend to us for our customers that would be useful for people to read about climate adaptation, or even novels or documentaries?
Yeah, one of the things that kind of came to mind for me, it's not a book or a novel, it's a report, which I think will instantly put people off. Like, oh, I don't want to read a report. But each year, the GCA, the Global Centre for Climate Adaptation, produced this report on stories of resilience. So they look globally at how people are building resilience, what they're doing to enact change, and they produce this report of really beautiful stories in terms of what people are doing. And I know from last year's one, they had things like in Cambodia, where they're getting high heat, but also flooding. It was hard to do backyard gardening, and a lot of people relied on that for food. So they've created these pens. So like you put your chickens in, but for crickets. And these pens can float. So if high waters come in, that the pens float. And in drought times, crickets need very little water. And so they're farming crickets and frying those up and eating them and creating protein source out of crickets. And, it's just this whole shift of what can change, how you can adapt, what you can do. And, just really lovely stories. You see photos of these people and they're so happy. They're creating new livelihoods out of it. They're really wonderful to read. And I think that often that's the sort of thing that's nice to look at now. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there, but hearing about how people and how local communities become more resilient, that to me is inspiring. So I'd recommend Stories of Resilience as a good read. And in terms of documentaries, anyone who knows me, I've always talked about this. There's a podcast called Timber Wars, and they also did a second iteration called Salmon Wars. And Timber Wars really looks at how old forests, old wood, how they were cut down, but others were trying to preserve them. And really that challenge of different people wanting to use a resource in different ways and who wins out. And then Salmon Wars looks at Native Americans and how they used to interact with rivers and with the salmon, and how that then changed with commercial salmon farming, and how now some of those indigenous groups are helping to bring back the salmon in a way that scientists weren't able to. So there's a lovely story in there as well, although it does involve eating salmon. So maybe for the vegans amongst us, stick on Timber Wars, and for others, maybe Salmon Wars is also of interest.
That brings me to two other questions. One is about yourself, and you were telling me that you are a vegan. You're also a Cornucopia customer, which is
Of
wonderful.
course.
But you decided to eat in a more sustainable way yourself, was it?
Yeah, so I went fully vegan now in 2018, and I had a number of reasons for that. My mother had sadly passed away. There is a lot of cancer sort of historically in my family, and a plant-based diet is seen to be protective, not necessarily fully plant-based, but a majority plant-based diet is one of the many things you can do. So that was a driver for me. Working within the climate space, the impact of animal agriculture and of meat on the climate is huge. It cannot be underestimated that there is a huge effect of that. There's methane released from the animals themselves, there's land degradation, there's loss of environment when we deforest in order to create more space for livestock. So really from a climate perspective, it's a no-brainer to remove animal products. Also, our decimation of the seas is really horrendous. We have a huge loss of biodiversity from the seas. Cod are almost not there anymore. We've eaten so many of them. So I just find it very sad. From a scientific point of view, in the climate perspective, it's not a good thing to do. And from a personal perspective, it makes me sad. And I love animals and I want there to be biodiversity out there on the planet. And yeah, and I
Very
have to say,
interesting.
Cornucopia, such a haven. It's so lovely to be able to go into the centre of Dublin and get a really good feed and feel great about it. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for your being a customer. The other question was about Indigenous knowledge and
Mm.
how that can be harvested, to use that word, because there is a lot of Indigenous knowledge around climate. It might be just noticing that the heron is flying south, so a storm is coming, or things like that. Was there much talk about that in the conference? I think you
Yeah, there really
mentioned.
was. And being based in Christchurch, so within New Zealand, you have the Maori tribes, and in the South Island of New Zealand, you have the Ngāi tribe, who are very prevalent there. So we had the chief of that tribe, Lisa Tumahai, was there speaking about what's important in terms of them and their knowledge and that relationship to the land. It was really prevalent within the discussions at Adaptation Futures. And in general, kind of looking back even just to ourselves at Ireland, you know yourself that we have all these folk stories, we have a relationship to nature. Oak trees used to be very sacred to us. We used to understand the seasons very well. And when you tap into that kind of older or indigenous knowledge, we have a relationship to nature, to the weather, to the climate that we've kind of lost as we've moved into urbanization, into more the time and age of science and technology. And so there needs to be a marrying between the two, bringing back this deep ancestral knowledge, but also matching it up with this kind of futurism that we can get from science and from new knowledge as well. And somewhere there's a perfect blend. And when somebody finds it, it's going to really change lives.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yes, we need a blend of science and community, science and traditional knowledge. Eleanor, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. And it was wonderful having you on the climate entrepreneurship course. And I thank you today. One question, how is that course going? How is the Trinity Climate Entrepreneurship course going? It's still.
Oh, so well. Yeah, it's still running and each year it changes and it's a little bit different. I mean, it's been brilliant every year. This year there's kind of a lot more people coming in from climate professional backgrounds, whereas previous years we've had people from, various different backgrounds and giving a real mix to it. And so it's just slightly different groups every time. But the community that comes out of that course, and you know yourself, Deirdre, just the WhatsApp groups are always alive. Everyone's always sharing. There's a real boost to people to be able to take action and do things when they come out of that course. So it's wonderful because that in itself actually is managing that gap between Trinity, obviously bringing rigorous knowledge to people, but the ability to create community out of it.
Yeah, well, that's what these podcasts are about. They're my entrepreneurship in Cornucopia effort having come out of the course. So thanks so much. I look forward to talking to you again soon. And by the way, we have a book club from my course. So we meet once a month and we read a book. Maybe the last one we read was Mancon Mangan's book, Let the Earth Speak. May he rest in peace. And it was wonderful to have this reason to get together and chat once a month or so about books around the environment that we read. So thanks very much, everybody. And see you soon, Eleanor. And keep the faith. Bye bye.
Bye.